Hello, my name is Victoria Faoro, and I'm glad you've joined us for part 2 of Making Food for Giving. In this video, we'll focus on ready-to-eat foods that require no preparation on the part of the recipient. We'll look at entrees, quick breads, and cookies. We'll talk about how to prepare the foods and also how to package them for giving. Full recipes will be provided at the end of the video. One of the most thoughtful gifts at any busy or stressful time is a full entree, ready to be popped in the oven to bake or reheat. Spinach lasagna is a good choice for giving. This recipe is not complicated. It involves just tomato sauce and these ingredients. I'll provide a recipe for my favorite tomato sauce, but it's also fine to use purchased tomato sauce. The first step is to select the pan you'll be using for giving. I've made it in everything from a small loaf pan with 2 servings to a larger rectangular roasting pan that will serve a full family. The size of the pan will dictate how many noodles will be needed and how many gifts the recipe will make. I like to make the recipe with 3 layers of noodles, 2 that have filling and sauce on top of them, and the last layer that is covered with just sauce. And then I always like to add a little extra sauce on top. I like to use no-bake or oven-ready noodles. They're thinner than regular lasagna noodles. I find that if you use them out of the package, they can produce a very dry lasagna. So I either boil them for a minute or 2, or most often I just hydrate them by letting them soak for about 25 minutes in water until they're fairly flexible all over. Then I drain them and lay them out on clean kitchen towels. To make the filling, saute onions and garlic. I saute the onions until they become fairly soft and then add the garlic for a minute or 2 until it becomes fragrant. Be sure to stir regularly so the garlic doesn't burn. I grate Parmesan or Romano cheese. I prefer Romano. This filling uses raw spinach in it. I chop the spinach and mix it in with the egg, cooled sautéed vegetables, ricotta cheese, and the grated cheese. Add parsley and season with salt and pepper. Next, I shred the mozzarella using a box grater, but I keep it separate. It helps to set up an assembly line with the noodles, the filling, the sauce, and the mozzarella. The first noodles are placed in a greased pan. 2 of the noodles I use fit perfectly in an 8-inch square cake pan. Spread the cheese mixture over the noodles. I'm using an offset spatula for that. Then mozzarella is spread over the cheese mixture. Cover with a thin layer of sauce and repeat the process. I add that 3rd layer of noodles and cover it with sauce only. You always want to end a lasagna with sauce, no matter what's underneath it. At this point, you have several options. I like to bake the lasagna and then give it refrigerated or frozen. To bake it, bring it to 165 degrees and then refrigerate it. You always want to avoid letting food sit when it's in the danger zone of 41 degrees to 140 degrees. If you're unsure when you'll be giving it, it's always best to freeze it. Be sure to always create a label for any gift of food. It's especially important for anything that might need to be baked. The label should include the name of the recipe, storage instructions, cooking or baking instructions, and ingredients. The label can be printed on a home computer printer and neatly cut using a rotary cutter. A bow completes the package. Leftover lasagna filling and noodles can make a great second gift or cannelloni dinner for your family. Put a spoon of filling across the end and roll a noodle up. I tend to trim the noodle once I've completed 1 roll to lessen the amount of pasta, but you could keep rolling. Bake them and then put 4 in a food storage container with extra sauce. They freeze beautifully and warm up very well in a microwave oven. Homemade tomato sauce on its own is also a very versatile gift. Here is the sauce I make for this lasagna and most dishes that require tomato sauce. The recipe only includes olive oil, crushed tomatoes, garlic, dried basil, parsley, black pepper, salt, and a little sugar. As an entire head of garlic is used, this is a wonderful time to use a mini food processor to chop that. To make the sauce, sauté the garlic in olive oil. I start with a cold pan. Add the olive oil and the garlic and warm both together. That way your garlic doesn't burn. I always have my cans of crushed tomatoes opened and sitting by the stove so I can pour at least one in the minute the garlic seems to be on the verge of browning. Add all of the other ingredients, stir, and let simmer until the sauce is the thickness that you like. I give the sauce in quart jars. Be sure you let people know that you've not canned it for long-term storage, though. On the other hand, if you would like to actually can it, you could, following the directions for your canning equipment. For a label that looks a little less homemade, I often trace around a quarter and trim the label to round the edges before gluing it down. Chili is another versatile entree for giving. This is a vegetarian chili that's also enjoyed by non-vegetarians. It uses bulgur, which when cooked has a texture very like broken up pieces of ground beef. Bulgur and tomato paste are combined in a bowl and boiling water is added to partially cook the bulgur. I then prepare the beans and tomatoes, so they're ready to add when I need them. I always opt for low or reduced sodium whenever possible. You'll use the juice along with the tomatoes, so don't drain them. You do need to rinse and drain the kidney beans. Next, sauté chopped onions and garlic, and then add the chopped carrots and spices and sauté briefly. This heightens the flavor of the spices and flavors the oil. Next, add the chopped peppers and sauté further. Add the chopped tomatoes and their juices, the drained and rinsed kidney beans, the liquid of your choice, and stir to combine. Bring all to a boil and simmer. You can adjust the seasonings once it has simmered. This chili is easy to warm up and can be served plain or topped with raw onions, cheese, or parsley, and can be served with fresh lime as well. Put in a food storage container with an added bow and label, this becomes a very convenient gift. Sometimes an entree isn't the best gift. For many occasions, a sour cream coffee cake with its swirl of cinnamon, sugar, and nuts works well. Cream the butter, sugar, eggs, and vanilla in a large mixing bowl. I used to use pure vanilla extract for all my cooking, but America's Test Kitchens discovered that when you're cooking or baking a recipe, quality imitation vanilla tastes just as good as pure vanilla extract. So for some recipes, like this, I use imitation vanilla. On the other hand, if I'm making an icing or something else that won't be cooked, I always use pure vanilla extract. Alternate adding dry ingredients and the sour cream. It's always best when alternating wet and dry ingredients to begin with dry. You do this because butter is not able to absorb liquid, but it does coat the flour so less gluten develops, which helps keep the bread tender. Be sure to stir the batter only enough to combine the ingredients. In a small bowl, combine the chopped nuts, cinnamon, and brown sugar. I like to chop the nuts fairly fine for this recipe, so I use a small food processor, but you could leave them larger if you prefer. This can be made in a tube pan or 2 loaf pans. The recipe includes instructions for both. I really like to make it in a tube pan, so I spread 1/3 of the batter over the bottom of a greased pan. Then I sprinkle a little less than half the filling over that layer. Spread another third of the batter over the filling and sprinkle most of the remaining filling, keeping about 2 tablespoons aside. Spread the rest of the batter and sprinkle the 2 tablespoons of filling over the top. If you spread more on top, it just tends to fall off. Bake, then cool for about 15 minutes. Run a knife around the sides and center and turn it out on a rack. You could use a tube pan with a removable center, but this cake really does come out well without one. Unless I'm presenting an entire coffee cake, I wrap it in plastic wrap and refrigerate it so I can cut it. A quick bread will always slice more easily and neatly when it's cold. I like to give a plate of pieces when I give this coffee cake, unless giving it to a very large family or for some event. It makes a lot of coffee cake. I arrange slices on a plate, wrap the plate in plastic wrap, and then decorate with ribbon and a tag. It's a baked good that can be eaten any time of the day. Quick breads are also a great gift, especially at Thanksgiving or Christmas. This cranberry nut bread recipe is very popular with my family. Often for cranberry breads, the cranberries are sweetened, but for this, they're not. I like to make it with halved cranberries, so there's a great contrast between the sweet bread and the tart cranberry. An orange is zested and juiced, too. I use a microplane for zesting the orange. Combine the orange rind and juice, boiling water, and 2 tablespoons of butter and stir to melt the butter. In another bowl, beat the egg and sugar, then stir in the orange mixture. Mix in the cranberries and chopped walnuts or pecans. Sift together the dry ingredients and add them, stirring only until all ingredients are combined. Bake in a greased pan and cool on a rack. At holiday time, I sometimes bake the recipe in 3 small pans, which enables me to give a whole loaf. An entire large loaf is almost too much for a small family. The other thing I do is slice it and present it in a bag or on a plate. I refrigerate it overnight and then slice it. It makes a colorful gift that keeps well refrigerated or frozen. My tag always includes information not just about the ingredients, but also about storage. Pumpkin bread is another popular bread, especially at Thanksgiving time. For this recipe, we'll cream butter, sugar, pumpkin, eggs, and water. The batter will look a bit like it's curdled, but that's fine. It hasn't. Next, stir in the combined dry ingredients, which include cinnamon and cloves, and then stir in raisins and chopped nuts. I tend to leave nuts in fairly large pieces for cranberry nut and pumpkin bread, but it also works fine to finely chop them. Select pans for baking. This recipe makes 2 very large loaves. Here I've decided to make 1 large loaf and 4 small ones. If I'm giving a small loaf, I sometimes enclose it in a clear bag, but you might want to present it in the tin, which makes it travel very easily. I have to admit that often my aluminum foil pans are too recycled for that. What I most often do is make large loaves and cut them into thirds and present an assortment of breads. Here I have 2 segments, wrapped separately so the flavors remain distinct, joined by a decorative bow. It's often nice for people to receive several kinds of bread rather than just one. Cookies can be a welcome addition to the holiday season. Every year my mother made and sent many boxes of her homemade Christmas cookies to friends and family, and I carried on that tradition for over 40 years. I would bake for days and then set up an assembly line to fill each plate with a little bit of everything. I discovered that I could cover the filled plate with plastic wrap, add a bow, and then cover the cookies with a second plate turned upside down to create a kind of clamshell container. I'd tape the 2 plates together and enclose all in a padded envelope, recycled of course. These packages actually traveled very well through the postal system. I thought I would share a few of the cookie recipes that I've found to work well for giving. A very popular cookie is the Nutmeg Flat, an easy-to-make shortbread cookie. It includes only these ingredients: butter, sugar, an egg yolk, flour, and nutmeg. As with any shortbread cookie, it's important to use butter rather than a substitute if possible. For this cookie, I always use freshly ground nutmeg. In fact, nutmeg is the one spice that I usually grate just before using, for full flavor. I use a microplane to do that. Whole nutmegs store very well for 4 or 5 years, so they're easy to keep on hand. After the butter, sugar, egg, and nutmeg have been creamed, the flour is added. Then you mix on a low speed, only as long as needed to integrate the flour. Anytime you add flour to cookie dough, you want to mix as little as possible because you don't want to develop the gluten, which would make the cookies tough. Next, spread the dough to cover a baking sheet. I do that with an offset spatula, but you could do that with whatever works well for you. Next, an egg white is slightly beaten and then spread over the surface of the dough. You can see how it adds a gloss. Bake for 65 minutes. The egg white will nicely brown and remain somewhat glossy. Cut these shortbread while warm. You can use a cutting board as a guide for making straight rows if need be. You can also use a pizza cutter as you would a rotary cutter, though I usually just cut mine by eye using a thin knife. The nice thing about a bar cookie is that you can cut the cookies the size that works for your container or for your other cookies. I often give these as a gift on their own. 2 cocktail napkins on top of a plastic appetizer plate can add holiday colors. You can arrange the cookies in rows or around the plate. Because you can space the cookies in many ways, you can adjust the number as needed and still have a full-looking plate. I cover the plate with plastic wrap and then add a bow. This gift is easily handed to someone, put in a work mailbox, or covered and sent in a padded envelope. Sesame crisps are another cookie that travels and stores well, and that can be made in any size. Its key ingredients are sesame seeds and shredded coconut, and this is another cookie that is definitely best made with butter. Sesame seeds and coconut are toasted in the oven to boost their flavors. Butter, sugar, and eggs are creamed, and the rest of the ingredients are then mixed in. I then form the dough into logs, wrap them in plastic wrap, and refrigerate them. Later, I remove them from the refrigerator and slice them into evenly sized cookies. You can reshape the cookies as needed. Just press the bits and pieces against the edge before baking. You can also not refrigerate the dough and drop the cookies by spoonful and flatten them with the bottom of a glass, or roll them into balls and flatten them. If you do that, the cookies will look more like the one with the green arrow. The sesame seeds will be whole rather than sliced through. Either way works. For giving, I like them to be neatly shaped. One way of packaging cookies is to put them in a bag, which you can tie with a ribbon. Or you can reuse a clamshell container from fruits or vegetables. Making cookies fit a container can be challenging. I wasn't crazy about the sideways cookies needed for this container. I next tried creating a filler of heavy paper, but the white looked very stark. I tried using a darker cardstock, and the filler seemed to work better. With added fall leaves and an orange bow, we had a gift. One warning, it's amazing how many cookies will fit in most boxes. It may take many more than a small plate would. Chocolate is always an appreciated gift. These world peace cookies are double chocolate, and they don't involve melting chocolate, which results in their being much easier to make. For these cookies, you cream the butter, sugars, salt, and vanilla. Then add the dry ingredients: flour, cocoa powder, baking soda, mixing only until incorporated. Toss in the chocolate chips. I like bittersweet chocolate, but semi-sweet chocolate works well too. It's okay if the dough looks crumbly. Shape into logs, wrap in plastic wrap, and refrigerate 3 hours. The tube from a roll of paper towels works great for keeping the roll rounded. Any of these cookies we're shaping into logs and refrigerating could actually be frozen for baking later. Just thaw the roll until it can be sliced and bake for a minute longer than usual. Slice off cookies and repair as needed. You can press any stray pieces or cracked cookies into the perfect shape. Bake just 12 minutes. They won't look done, but they will be. Let them cool on the baking sheet and then remove to a rack. These cookies are a little more delicate, so they benefit from being presented in a container. I like using a clear clamshell. I usually create a liner for the container and experiment with different ways of arranging the cookies. Note that the difference between my two potential arrangements is a difference of 7 cookies. My first thought is always to use parchment paper for the container liner, but notice how the butter in these cookies leaves unattractive grease marks on that paper. I use wax paper as a liner for buttery cookies. Also remember to make the container airtight. For this one, I wrapped the filled container in plastic wrap. I added a label with the ingredients and storage information and a ribbon with some holly. Almond wafers are a cookie that freezes very well, which is handy during the holiday season when you can't always make food the night before you plan to give it. These cookies also travel very well. Water, butter, and cinnamon are heated and then cooled. Slivered almonds and sugar are added. The dry mixture of flour, baking soda, and salt is slowly added to make a stiff dough. This dough is shaped into rectangular bars, wrapped and chilled. You may find it easier to wrap the rectangle in parchment paper first, but if you do, be sure to then wrap in plastic wrap so the dough doesn't dry out. I usually just wrap it in plastic wrap. Slice the chilled dough. If you want to make smaller cookies, you can slice the rectangle into the long way, as shown at right, before slicing off cookies. Bake the cookies and cool them on a rack. These cookies are very stackable, but I warn you, lots fit in a small bag. Florentines are a special treat. Instead of the traditional candied fruits, I've developed a recipe that uses a mixture of dried fruits. Fruits and nuts are mixed with flour. Butter, sugar, and corn syrup are heated. All are combined and the dough is dropped on sheets and baked. The cookies cool on the baking sheet until firm enough to be removed. Then they're cooled on paper towels. The flat side of the cookie against the baking sheet becomes the top of the cookie. They can be given as is, or melted chocolate can be brushed over the flat side that has become the top of the cookie. These cookies are beautiful but fragile, so they need to be packaged accordingly. Ginger snaps have been a favorite cookie in my family for years. This recipe was my great-grandmother's. It's a standard recipe. You cream the butter, sugar, molasses, and egg. Next, combine the flour, salt, ginger, baking soda, cinnamon, and cloves, and add to the creamed ingredients. To shape these cookies, roll them into balls. Roll the balls in sugar and put them on a baking sheet with room for spreading, and bake. You can make them any size. I make them very small, but I have a sister who makes hers into 4-inch cookies. The recipe works well with any size. You may just need to adjust the baking time. Depending on the amount of time you bake these, you can keep them chewy or bake them longer until they're crisp. Experiment with the baking time that produces a cookie you like. These stack well for giving, but they don't mix well. The strong spice will flavor every cookie in the package with them. I try to package them separately if I'm giving them. Fruit and nut bites are a healthier no-bake alternative to holiday cookies. For this treat, dried apricots, dates, raisins, and coconut are chopped in a food processor. If you're using whole dates, be sure to remove the pits before chopping them. This mixture is put in a bowl, and a small amount of confectioner's sugar and orange juice or sherry are added to the fruit and nuts. The mixture is formed into small balls. Each ball is rolled in chopped nuts to coat. I use a food processor to chop the nuts finely enough for this. These store very well in the refrigerator or freezer depending on your schedule. Cupcake papers work well as spacers for the fruit and nut bites, keeping them contained and separated. Be sure to select the correct size for a professional presentation. The pastel papers are too large for these bites. The smaller foil papers work well. Not only do the papers nicely contain the bites, but they fill the container out. I've used another recycled produce clamshell for these. I've enclosed the filled clamshell in plastic wrap and added a bow and tag listing the ingredients. This concludes part 2 of Making Food for Giving. Following are recipes for the foods we've made in this video. Remember that you can pause the video at any point to review a recipe more closely. Here are the recipes for fruit and nut bites and nutmeg flats. The World Peace Cookie recipe is on this page. Next is the recipe for Sesame Crisp cookies. The recipe for Florentines is featured on this page. Here are the recipes for ginger snaps and for cranberry nut bread. Another quick bread recipe is featured on this page, one for pumpkin bread. Next is the recipe for a sour cream coffee cake. The first entree recipe is included on this page, spinach lasagna. And here is the recipe for the tomato sauce used in the spinach lasagna. And last is the recipe for a second entree, vegetarian chili. Thank you for watching this video. We hope you found some recipes that work well for you for giving or to prepare for your family and friends. If you haven't already viewed part 1, be sure to take a look at that. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to click on the subscribe button so you're notified whenever I post a new cooking video. Thank you again.